So you turn on the news, right? And you see these massive, booming numbers about how our global economy is growing, GDP is up, everything looks fantastic on paper. But then you look at your own bank account and wonder, why doesn't it feel like I'm getting any richer? If the economic pie is getting bigger, why does my slice feel exactly the same or maybe even a little smaller? It's a paradox that frustrates literally millions of people. And today, we're going to break down exactly why this is happening. Well, to really get what's going on, we got to look at what Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee has to say about it. And he doesn't mince words when it comes to our total obsession with gross domestic product. He actually compares GDP to sausage making, saying it's messy, and if you truly knew what went into it, you probably wouldn't trust it so blindly. His core argument is that GDP is kind of just an illusion if we don't look at per capita income, and crucially, how that wealth is actually being distributed across the board. So welcome to this explainer. To figure out where all the wealth is actually going, we're taking a journey through our modern economic reality. We'll be using Banerjee's decades of ground-level research to deconstruct the economy, starting from the hyper-rich, moving to the squeezed middle class, all the way down to the bottom. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the big GDP illusion, AI and the hollowing middle, the myth of the lazy poor, escaping the poverty trap, and finally, rethinking our economic future. Let's just jump right in. Section 1, the big GDP illusion. Let's look at why massive economic growth doesn't naturally trickle down. Okay, so we're living in a world of what economists call massive increasing returns. Think about it like this. If you own some highly desirable intellectual property, say the algorithm behind ChatGPT or the brand power of Prada, your product is infinitely scalable. It costs you practically zero to distribute it to one more person globally. Because of that, wealth accumulates at the very top at an absolutely astonishing rate. Meanwhile, if you're in the middle class, you're anchored to your local labor market. Your wages are totally constrained by local inflation and local demand. The rich are getting much, much richer because the global marketplace rewards scale in a way that local jobs just can't compete with. Moving right along to Section 2, AI and the hollowing middle. Let's see how artificial intelligence is accelerating this divide. So who's actually in the crosshairs of all this tech disruption? For the longest time, we kind of assumed automation was just coming for blue-collar, physical labor. But Banerjee's analysis points out something super interesting. The modern AI labor shift is actually targeting the white-collar middle class. Mid-level software coding, accounting, medical transcription. These are jobs where AI is just faster and cheaper. On the flip side, the jobs that are safe right now are the ones requiring deep human connection or physical presence. Think healthcare professionals, teachers, and highly creative roles. What this actually means on the ground is a massive middle-class squeeze. Take India, for example. Salaries ranging from 30,000 to 3 lakh rupees a month have practically flatlined. And when you adjust that for inflation over the last couple of decades, they've actually fallen. While corporate wealth is soaring, the exact jobs that historically built a stable, comfortable middle class are disappearing or just stagnating. Honestly, if you've been feeling like you have to run simply to stay in place, this data completely validates that. You aren't imagining things. Which brings us to Section 3, the myth of the lazy poor. If the middle class is squeezed, what is happening at the very bottom? I want you to keep this number in your head, 140. It represents a massive meta-analysis of 140 different studies conducted by USAID, and it answers one of the absolute most hotly debated political questions in the world. Do welfare and cash transfers, what some people call freebies, do they make people lazy? The answer, backed up by 140 independent studies, is definitively no. In fact, cash transfers actually make people work slightly more. Let's break down the assumption versus the hard evidence here. The conventional wisdom, you've probably heard it, is that if you give people free money, they'll just stop working and become dependent on the state. But behavioral economics proves that's just not true. Banerjee highlights these fascinating experiments, one in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh and another over in Uganda. In both places, when people were explicitly offered the choice between getting paid to do absolutely nothing or getting paid slightly less but having to work, they consistently prefer to work. Opportunity creates enthusiasm. When you give someone struggling in poverty a baseline of resources, they don't get lazy, they finally get the mental and physical bandwidth to actually invest in their future. All right, Section 4, escaping the poverty trap. If cash helps, how do we actually pull people out of poverty for good? Banerjee explains this using a brilliant concept called the S-curve, and it perfectly illustrates why small, well-meaning aid often completely misses the mark. Imagine you're at step 1, extreme poverty. You don't have enough calories, maybe you're anemic, which literally means your blood isn't carrying enough oxygen, so you are just exhausted all the time. Now look at step 2. Say a charity gives you a tiny bit of money and you use it to stock 6 packets of biscuits in your tiny shop instead of 2. Well, that changes almost nothing. Nobody's going to flock to your shop just for 4 extra packets of biscuits, right? You're still trapped. To actually escape, you have to hit step 3, the threshold. You need enough capital to stock biscuits, plus shampoo, plus toothpaste, plus chips. Only then do you have a real viable business that attracts customers. To actually test this out, Banerjee's team ran a randomized controlled trial over in Kenya. They compared 2 very different ways of giving aid. One group was promised a drip feed, basically a small monthly payment of about $8 to $9, guaranteed for 12 straight years. The other group, though, received a massive upfront lump sum, which was equivalent to just 2 years' worth of those payments. And wow, the results were honestly paradigm shifting. The upfront lump sum generated way more long-term businesses than the 12-year promise of monthly drips. Why is that? Well, because small drips of money just get immediately absorbed by daily survival needs, fixing a leaky roof, buying food for the week. But a lump sum, that acts as a massive capital injection. It pushes a person right past that S-curve threshold we just talked about, giving them the critical mass they actually need to start a self-sustaining business. Now, if you're wondering how long these effects actually last, check out this stunning study from West Bengal. Researchers found some of the most extremely poor women in rural villages. They gave them a single major asset, like a cow or a goat, and provided just 1 year of active support and encouragement. When those same researchers went back 17 years later, those women were still 40% richer than their peers. Think about that. A single, substantial intervention created a generational escape velocity from poverty. That brings us to our final section, Section 5, Rethinking Our Economic Future. How do we take these lessons and apply them on a macro level? We really have to start viewing targeted public investment not as a drain on resources, but as a foundational lift for the whole economy. Banerjee points out that in India, massive welfare programs like the Public Distribution System for Food or the NREGA Rural Employment Guarantee have actually been incredibly successful at pushing up wages from the absolute bottom. Because if a worker knows they can survive in their own village with basic food subsidies and guaranteed rural work, they simply aren't going to migrate to a city to accept abusive, hyper-low wages. That safety net effectively forces the entire wage floor to move upward. Now, here's a totally fascinating comparison that kind of flips our usual political narratives upside down. Welfare schemes are super visible, right? And they're constantly criticized in the media as dull politics. But Banerjee notes a massive contradiction when you look at tax havens. Tax havens and corporate loopholes drain vastly more money from government revenues than welfare programs ever could. Yet, they rarely generate the same level of public outrage as providing free rations to poor families. We tend to hyperfixate on the visible costs of baseline survival while almost completely ignoring the massive hidden leaks at the very top of the economy. And that brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. We're entering this era where AI is aggressively hollowing out the middle class. You even have tech leaders openly suggesting that we'll eventually need universal basic income just to support displaced workers. But as Banerjee rightly asks, who is actually going to pay for it? Are we, as a society, really prepared to implement a 70% tax rate on the ultra-rich to fund a world where technology does all the work? It's a massive question of human well-being versus technological efficiency. And honestly, it's a debate that policymakers, business leaders, and all of us need to start having right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it gave you some powerful new frameworks for understanding the world around us. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.